My name is Kesha, and I am 39 years old, and the night before Christmas Eve was one of those quiet moments in my penthouse apartment when everything felt like it was finally at peace, and the warm scent of pine needles blended with cinnamon candles while my son Leo sat on the carpet, carefully wrapping a handmade gift with his tongue peeking out from the corner of his mouth in focused determination, and the soft hum of Christmas music filled the space as the cold Atlanta rain streaked down the massive windows behind him, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that we were safe in this life I'd worked so hard to build and protect and love. And Leo, who was 8 years old, had spent weeks preparing a poem for his grandmother, carefully working through his dyslexia with Dr. Allen, and sounding out each word until he could recite it with pride, and his world was still magical and simple, and Christmas was everything to him. And watching him wrap that imperfect gift for Brenda, my mother, who had never once attended a therapy session or asked about his progress, made my heart ache even as it swelled with pride. And all the long hours at the office, all the investment meetings, all the lonely late nights at the top of the data analytics world had felt worth it to create this fortress around him and me. And for the first time I truly believed we were untouchable, but that illusion shattered in one vibrating second when my phone lit up on the counter with a name. Always carried a weight. Brenda, and I didn't want to answer, but I did because that's what I had always done, and her voice sharp and cold as sleet greeted me without warmth, and she went straight into her decree. Kesha, your father and I have decided the party is adults only this year. We want something elegant, you understand. And I stood there in silence, letting her words hang between us, and my eyes drifted to Leo humming Jingle Bells and adding a final piece of tape to his gift. And I asked her gently, but what about Leo? He's been practicing a poem. He made you something. He's so excited. And she replied with that clipped tone she always used when I was being inconvenient. It's just one night. Hire a nanny. Alicia is making arrangements for her 3, so it's only fair you do the same for your 1. And it was settled, and she hung up, not even bothering to say good-bye or ask about her grandson. And I stood frozen in the warmth of my apartment with the coldest emptiness blooming in my chest, and I had to turn and tell Leo. I had to look into those hopeful eyes and say something that would protect him from a truth. No child should ever have to feel that his family didn't think he mattered. And I crouched beside him and told him softly that Grandma wanted a quiet grown-up party and we would have our own fun at home. And I watched the joy vanish from his face, and his small body crumbled into mine, and he sobbed, not because of the party, but because he had tried so hard. He had practiced. Grandma, he believed she would care, and that poem wasn't just a poem. It was a mountain he had climbed, a symbol of his worth, and she had stomped on it like it was nothing. And the pain in his shoulders as he cried against me lit a fire in my heart that I had been suppressing for decades. And I knew right then I was done begging for scraps of love from people who only saw me as a wallet and Leo as a detail. And I wiped my tears and held him all night. And the next evening I arrived at my parents' house alone, my son too heartbroken to even say good-bye, staying with a top-level nanny I hired last minute. And I pulled into the wide paved driveway of the 6-bedroom home I bought for them 3 years ago, a gift meant to bring the family together, but now a monument to betrayal. And I sat in the car with the expensive gifts beside me, and I told myself, just smile, get through the night, and get home. But the second I reached the grand front door, I heard something that made my stomach turn. Not music, not adult chatter, but shrieking, laughing, screaming children. And I froze, and I pushed open the door, and what I saw nearly made me collapse. Inside the house was chaos. My sister Alicia's 3 children were tearing through the grand foyer, tearing open gifts from under the massive 20-foot tree, smashing ornaments, shrieking with joy. And my brother-in-law, Scott, was sitting on the stairs filming the whole thing with pride, yelling encouragement. And not one adult stopped them, not one raised a hand to teach them manners. And there was no Alicia, no Brenda, no one to explain this hypocrisy, and my face burned with the betrayal I had feared. And when my mother finally appeared with a tray of champagne flutes, her expression flickered for only a second before settling into fake warmth. Kesha, darling, you made it. Come in. And I did not move, and I looked her dead in the eyes and asked her, what is this? And she played innocent like she always did, saying it was just a party, and she whispered like it was some funny misunderstanding that Alicia had needed a break and Scott was stressed, and the kid needed support, and I reminded her of what she said to me, that Alicia had arranged for her 3, and this did not look like a sitter, this looked like a lie, and she dismissed it with that same tired tone. Kesha, you are strong, you can handle things. Alicia is sensitive, she needs help, and I knew then what I had always known but refused to accept, that my child was never going to be seen by her as a person, just as an extension of me, someone inconvenient and disposable. And then Alicia appeared, her voice dripping with smug superiority, accusing me of needing attention and mocking Leo, saying he preferred books and wouldn't enjoy the party anyway, and I stood there choking on my rage, trying to breathe, while she sipped champagne in a dress I had likely paid for, and my brother-in-law laughing, while their kids smashed everything in sight, and I walked past them into the house that I had paid for and dropped the expensive gifts by the tree without care, and made myself a drink because I had to survive the next 2 hours. And then I heard something that broke me for good. I went into the kitchen and saw Leo's cake, the one thing he asked for, destroyed. Alicia's kids had climbed onto counters and smashed the beautiful 16-layer red velvet cake from Southern Sweets, the one he wanted more than anything, and they were laughing, covered in red frosting, while Scott filmed the whole thing, calling them savages. And when I told him to stop, they finally paused, looking guilty, but Alicia burst in yelling at me like I had done something wrong, and Brenda followed, annoyed, asking what was the big deal, and I pointed at the mess and said it was for Leo, and Brenda just looked at me with her cold expression and said it's just a cake, and that was the last thing I needed to hear to know what I had to do next. And I felt something inside me shift into place, hard and final. And I knew this night was going to be the last night I let any of them treat me or my son like we didn't matter, because it was not just a cake, it was my son's heart, and they crushed it and laughed, and I was done playing nice, done being the strong one who paid for everything and kept quiet, and I was about to show them exactly how much they had underestimated me. I stood there in that lavish kitchen, surrounded by the smell of expensive ruined frosting, and the sound of everyone pretending nothing was wrong, while the reality was that everything was wrong and had been for years. And as my mother scolded me for daring to react to a cake being destroyed, I could feel something cold and sharp rising inside me, not rage, not sadness, but something even stronger, a final breaking point where all the tolerance I had forced myself to maintain for decades simply disintegrated. And I placed my glass of untouched champagne on the counter with the softest click, and slowly reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, and their eyes followed me, assuming I was doing what they expected, maybe calling the nanny, maybe trying to order another dessert, maybe calling to cry to someone, but what I was actually doing was unlocking the banking app that held all their lives together without them even realizing it. And I scrolled past my business accounts and past my savings until I found the section labeled Authorized Users. And then I looked up at Alicia, who was still sipping her drink like the queen of this fraudulent kingdom, and I said her name softly, and she rolled her eyes and snapped, "What now, Kesha? Are you going to give me another parenting lecture? Because I promise you I am not in the mood." And I said, "No, that American Express Platinum card. The one I gave you, the one with a 15,000 limit for emergencies, the one I pay the $695 annual fee for. I just canceled it." And her mouth fell open, and she laughed and said, "What are you talking about? Did you finally raise the limit? I told you. I cannot run a household on that small amount. I need at least 30,000 for spring." And I hit the cancel button right there, while she was still grinning, and then showed her the green check mark on the screen, and told her, "No, it is gone, effective immediately, and what you have now is just a piece of plastic." And her face changed from amusement to shock as the room fell silent, and even my father looked up from his plate, and finally my mother's eyes narrowed, and her voice sharpened into a screech. "Kesha, what did you just do? You better put that card back right now. You have no right to humiliate your sister on Christmas." And I turned to her with a calm voice and said, "I do not owe her anything, and I do not owe you either." And my brother-in-law Scott jumped in with that smug, condescending voice of his, trying to sound like the voice of reason, but instead dripping with patronizing confidence, saying, "Wow, Kesha, you are really acting out. Are you having a meltdown? You need us. You cannot survive without your family." And I stared at Him, the man who lived in my house, drove a car I helped finance, and had the audacity to say I needed him, and I laughed coldly and replied, "You are right, I am alone, and I just realized how good that actually feels," and he started to backtrack, but I interrupted him saying, "Let us talk about your music career, Scott. That 50,000 I gave you last year, that was not an investment. You signed a promissory note, and my lawyers will be in touch because you now have 30 days to pay me back with interest, or I am suing you personally." And he blinked like he had been slapped, and Alicia gasped, "You cannot do that," and I held up the document he signed and showed them both, and said, "Yes, I can, and yes, I will." And while Scott stumbled backwards like the room was spinning, I turned to my mother, who now looked like she was physically shaking, and Alicia was grabbing her son, as if that would shield her from the truth, and screamed, "What about my kids? What about their school? What about their future?" And I looked at her dead in the eye, and said, "You want to talk about their future? You already stole my son's future." And everyone went quiet, and she sputtered, "I never stole anything," and I pulled up another document on my phone and explained how 2 years ago I had opened a college fund for Leo with 50,000 in a trust, and how 6 months ago that entire amount had been withdrawn and traced to Alicia's shared account with Scott, and my mother had co-signed as secondary trustee, which meant she approved it. And I showed the withdrawal, and my mother gasped, "Kesha, no, that cannot be true." And I said, "It is, and you knew it. You both knew what that money was for, and you gave it to a failed studio and a pair of leeches." And Alicia tried to defend herself, saying it was a loan, and we were going to pay it back, but I cut her off, saying, "You stole from an 8-year-old, and not just from his bank account, from his future." And then I looked at my mother and said, "You remember last year when Leo was diagnosed with dyslexia, and I told you we needed 15,000 for his therapy, and I asked you for help. And you said no, you said it was nonsense, and that he was probably just lazy, and I would spoil him if I paid for it." And then 2 weeks later, I saw your bank statement left open on your desk with a 20,000 wire to Alicia for redecoration, and I knew then that my son did not matter to you, and I took out a business loan to get him that therapy because I refused to let your rejection define him. And then I waited to see if you would do it again, and you did, and now I know the truth. And Alicia's face turned into pure panic, and she stammered, "I did not think you would notice," and I whispered, "You did not think I would track it. You forgot I analyze data for a living, and now you are caught. And it is not just immoral, it is illegal." And she started crying, but I saw through it, and I said, "Save your tears, they are not going to work anymore." And then she tried to throw another chain around my neck, saying, "What about the Escalade, the $80,000 car you co-signed for? You are stuck with that. If I stop paying, your credit is ruined." And I smiled and said, "You missed 2 payments, and I covered them to protect my score, and that gave me the legal right to file a release of liability, which my lawyers already processed, and now the bank is calling the note due, and you have 48 hours to refinance, or the car will be repossessed, and your last safety net will be gone." And Scott turned pale, and Alicia started screaming, and my mother was yelling, and the whole room dissolved into chaos. But I stayed calm and said, "You all told me I had to leave. You said this was your house, your rules, and now I am telling you this is my house, and you are not welcome." And they did not believe me, and my father, who had been mostly silent, looked at me with a tired voice and said, "Kesha, please, this is our home, we are family." And I pulled out my phone and showed them the title deed and the trust documents proving that the house belonged to the L.V. Vance Living Trust, which listed me as the trustee and Leo as the beneficiary, and that they were not even tenants, they were guests with no legal claim. And my mother collapsed into a chair, her mouth open and speechless, and Alicia shouted, "This is illegal, and you cannot do this." And I handed my father a white envelope from my lawyer and said, "This is a 30-day notice to vacate, and you have until the end of January to leave, because I am selling this house and liquidating the asset." And they all screamed and cried, but I said, "I will not leave you homeless. I will buy you a condo in a retirement community 3 hours away with strict rules that do not allow long-term guests, and that means, Alicia, you cannot live there. And Scott, you cannot build your fake studio there." And my mother tried to thank me, but I stopped her and said, "This is not a gift, this is containment, and it is the last thing I will ever do for you." And the look on Alicia's face when she realized she had lost everything was like watching a mirror break. into 1,000 pieces, and they begged, and they cursed, and they pleaded, but I was done, and I picked up my purse and walked to the door with the same dignity they tried to strip from me. And I said one last thing to Alicia: good luck with public school. I hear it builds character, and I opened the door and stepped into the cold night air, and for the first time in 39 years I could breathe, and I closed the door behind me without looking back, and the sound of it shutting was the most powerful thing I had ever heard. As I pulled the front door closed behind me, the December air slapped my cheeks like a blessing. It was cold and clear and real, and it smelled like new beginnings, not peppermint or cinnamon, not fake joy or decorated lies, but something clean, something true, and I stepped off the porch with my purse in hand, no cake, no coat, no apology, and walked toward my Tesla like I was floating, like I was walking out of a burning building, while the fire raged behind me, and I did not turn around because I had nothing left to say, nothing more to prove, and as the engine purred to life, I backed out slowly from curved driveway of the house I had bought for people who saw my generosity as weakness and my silence as submission, and through the front window I could see it all happening like a theater stage behind glass: my mother Brenda collapsing to her knees, my father Joseph crouching beside her screaming her name, trying to wake her up, while Alicia and Scott exploded at each other like animals cornered and betrayed, and every second I watched felt like a reminder of the storm I had spent years holding off with money, with gifts, with the lie that maybe, if I just gave more, loved harder, swallowed the insults deeper, they would finally treat me and my son like we mattered. But now the dam had broken, and the flood of truth was sweeping through that house and destroying everything that had once stood on my back, and I drove away feeling lighter than I had in my entire life, and the city lights blurred with tears, not of sorrow but of release, and I was not crying because I was sad, I was crying because I was finally free. And by the time I reached my apartment, it was almost midnight, and my penthouse glowed softly in the distance, a place that was truly mine, where my son was waiting, not knowing yet that his mother had just changed both their lives forever. And when I opened the door, Leo was asleep on the couch, his little body curled up in a blanket, the handmade gift still resting on the coffee table, and I knelt down, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "We are never going back," and I carried him to bed, tucked him in, and sat beside him, holding his tiny hand, knowing I had done what was right, not just for me, but for him, and I would tell him everything in the morning, when it was time, when he was ready, when he could understand what strength really looked like, not the kind that screams, but the kind that walks away and shuts the door and does not open it again. And the next day, Christmas morning, I made pancakes with whipped cream and strawberries, his favorite, and we opened the few gifts I had hidden away in my closet just for the two of us, and Leo asked if Grandma liked his poem, and I told him Grandma had missed it, but I loved it and would love to hear it, and he read it to me, voice trembling but proud, and I clapped and held him and promised that from now on he would never ever have to perform for people who refused to see him. And that was the first Christmas we spent in peace, no tension, no expectations, no walking on eggshells, just laughter and quiet joy. And for the first time in 8 years he did not cry once on Christmas. And I realized something else too, as I watched him build his new Lego set on the living room floor, that all the money I had poured into that family, all the vacations, the cars, the tuition, the spa days, the clothes, the mortgage payments, were not just gifts. They were a bribe, a constant, desperate plea, to be seen, to be loved, to be let in. And the truth was they never would have let me in, not really, because in their eyes, I was never one of them, not truly, not the favorite, not the delicate, not the one they wanted to protect. And once I stopped trying, everything became clear. And over the next week, the fallout began. Brenda called me every day, at first screaming, then sobbing, then begging, then threatening, then sobbing again. I ignored them all. I let the voicemails pile up. I read the texts only when I needed a reminder of why I had walked away. Alicia tried next. And when she realized I was not picking up, she sent long emails full of accusations and half apologies and twisted justifications, and I replied with a single message, "Everything you need." No is in the eviction letter. Speak to your lawyer. And Scott never contacted me at all, which told me everything I needed to know, because he had never cared about anyone but himself. And when the 30 days came to an end, I received a notification from my attorney that the house was vacated. Brenda and Joseph had moved into the condo. I had arranged for them a quiet retirement community with ocean views and strict visitor rules, just as I had promised, and the house was already being cleaned and staged, and within another month it was sold above asking price, and the money from that sale went straight into Leo's trust. Untouchable, protected, a future I was no longer afraid of losing to people who did not deserve to be in it. And one day in early spring, as the cherry blossoms bloomed in the park across from our building, Leo and I walked hand in hand, and he asked me again why we did not go to Grandma's house anymore, and I told him the truth in simple words, because sometimes people do not treat us the way we deserve to be treated, and when they show us who they are, we believe them, and we let them go, and he nodded in that thoughtful way children do, and said okay, and that was it. He did not cry, he did not ask again, he just accepted it because he felt safe, because I had made sure of it. And that night, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me and said, "I like it better here, Mom," and I smiled, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Me too, baby, me too." And in the months that followed, my business continued to grow. I hired more staff, opened new accounts, expanded into new markets, and I did it all without mentioning a word to my family, because they no longer had access to me or my world. And every time I felt the old familiar ache that used to pull me back into that cycle of guilt and obligation, I reminded myself of the cake, of the poem, of the phone call, of the way Brenda had said it is just a cake, and how that one sentence had ended an entire chapter of my life. And I realized then that I was not angry anymore, I was not bitter, I was not vengeful, I was healed, and healing did not mean forgetting, it meant remembering with clarity, and without pain, and every decision I made from that day forward was rooted in that clarity. My boundaries became unshakable, my time sacred, my energy protected, and when I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw the version of myself that tried so hard to be loved by people who only valued what I could give them. I saw a woman who had faced the storm and walked through it and come out on the other side, not unscathed but stronger, and I started writing again, something I had not done since college. I wrote about mothers and daughters, about wealth, worth, about inheritance and identity, about what it means to be the strong one, and how strength can sometimes look like silence, and sometimes look like a slammed door, and sometimes look like walking away. And I started sharing my writing anonymously online, and it resonated with people, strangers who told me their stories, people who saw themselves in my words, and I realized that by telling the truth I was not just freeing myself, I was giving others permission to do the same. And it was not revenge, not really, it was reclamation and redemption and renewal. And one day I received a package in mail with no return address, and inside was a photograph from when I was a teenager, me standing on the front porch of our old house, the first one I had bought for them, the one they mortgaged behind my back. And I was smiling, holding the keys, and beside me was Brenda, her arm around my shoulder, her smile wide and perfect and false, and on the back of the photo, in my handwriting from 2 decades ago, I had written, "Merry Christmas, Mom. I hope this is everything you ever wanted." And I stared at those words for a long time, and then I tore the photo in half and threw it away, because the truth was that house was never what I wanted, it was what I thought would finally make her love me. And now I knew better, and I did not need that reminder anymore. I had already built something so much stronger than a house. I had built a life for Leo, and for myself, one filled with truth and peace and laughter, and the quiet knowing that I had chosen us, and that was the greatest gift of all. Weeks passed after the Christmas fallout, and with every sunrise I felt a little less like the daughter who was constantly trying to earn love, and a little more like the woman who finally understood what self-respect actually looked like. And it was not loud or angry or bitter, it was quiet and steady, and it sounded like silence when I didn't answer their calls, and it looked like peace when I poured Leo a glass of orange juice in the morning while he laughed at cartoons, and it felt like the weight of 1,000 bricks being lifted from my shoulders every time I remembered I never had walk back into that house again, and my phone still buzzed with desperate attempts to pull me back into the cycle voicemails from Brenda that ranged from "how could you" to "we miss you" to "you're being cruel," and texts from Alicia filled with phrases like "family doesn't give up on each other" and "we need to talk," and Scott had finally entered a phase of pure silence which suited me just fine, and Joseph, my father, sent one email after another, all written like official statements, no emotion, just lines like "let us be reasonable" or "we are your parents," and while it used to tear at me, it now only confirmed what I already knew, that I had removed myself from a system that had only functioned because of my silence and generosity, and now that I was no longer participating, it was collapsing under the weight of its own entitlement. And while they scrambled, I spent time with Leo, who was thriving in ways I never imagined, and his reading improved with each passing week, and he started asking questions about how things worked not just in books, but in the world, and I took him on little weekend adventures, just the two of us, science museums, parks, quiet cafes with hot chocolate, and he would write little notes in his journal with help from his tutor, and he always ended them with "I am smart, I am strong, I am loved," and those words meant more to me than any apology Brenda could ever fake and mean. While the condo I had bought for my parents was being furnished by a third party, and when I received a message from the management company confirming move-in had been completed, I sighed with relief, because that meant they were gone from the house for good, and it was no longer a memory, it was now a transaction complete, a transfer of ownership executed cleanly with no strings attached, and I took Leah for a drive past the retirement community one afternoon and pointed out the golf course and the little pond with ducks, and he asked, "Does Grandma live here now?" And I nodded and said, "Yes, she does," and he just looked for a moment, then turned back to his comic book and said, "I hope she has nice curtains." And that was all he said, and that was all he needed to say, because his innocence had not been stolen. It had been protected, and that was my mission, and I was fulfilling it. And in the silence from my family, I felt the truth settle even deeper. They had never wanted me just what I could give them. And now that I had stopped giving, they did not know how to be, and I was not angry, I was free. And in the middle of February, I received a certified letter, not from my parents, not from Alicia, but from a lawyer. It was a poorly written legal threat, suggesting that the trust I had formed for Leo was unfairly excluding my family, and that I had violated some moral obligation to continue financially supporting them. And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so transparent. They were trying to use the language of legality to mask the language of entitlement, and I forwarded it to my own legal team, who drafted a swift and brutal response, and within 48 hours their lawyer had withdrawn the claim, and I knew exactly what had happened. They had tried to weaponize the one thing they thought they understood, money, and they failed because they underestimated how deeply I had protected everything connected to Leo and myself, and that was the last time they attempted anything legal, because they finally understood I had shut the door and locked it from the inside, and that there was no longer a key. And in March I received an invitation in the mail. It was not handwritten, it was not warm, it was a mass-printed card announcing a birthday party for one of Alicia's children, and on the back in bold lettering was the phrase "children only party, no adults," and I stared at it for a long time, not because I was considering going, but because of the message, and I knew what it was. It was not for the kids, it was a message from Alicia trying to show me that they were just fine without me trying to pretend the world was still turning on their terms. And I smiled because it proved everything I already knew, that the moment you remove yourself from someone else's delusion, they scramble recreate it without you. And I threw the card in the trash and went back to playing Monopoly with Leo, who had just beat me for the second time in a row, and who was now counting his play money with the precision of a banker. And I told him he had a gift, and he beamed and said, "Maybe I will be like you one day, Mom." And I said, "No, you will be better, you will be yourself." And one day in late spring, I took Leo to visit a library, downtown one, with massive shelves and quiet corners and old books that smelled like stories, and while he read, I wandered through the aisles and found myself in the psychology section where titles about family, trauma, and narcissism filled the shelves, and I picked up a few and leafed through them reading words that felt like they had been written about me. Daughters raised to believe their worth was transactional, women who were punished for being strong, children who became adults still begging for approval that would never come. And I closed the book and realized I did not need to read it to understand it. I had lived it and survived it, and now I was writing my own chapter, and I left without checking out anything because the only story I cared about now was the one I was living with Leo. And that summer I took him to the beach for the first time. We built sandcastles and collected shells and watched the sunset from the balcony of a small cottage I rented. And one night he looked at the stars and said, "I think Grandma was wrong." And I asked what he meant, and he said, "I think I am good at talking to people. I just need the right people." And I hugged him and said, "You are more than good, Leo. You are enough and always have been." And that night, as he slept beside me, the waves crashing in the distance, I realized that I was not just breaking cycles, I was building something new, something sacred, a life rooted in truth, in love, in boundaries, and in courage. And when fall came and the leaves began to turn, I received one final message. It was from Joseph, and it simply said, "I am sorry. I wish I had protected you." And I stared at that message for a long time, because it was the first time he had ever acknowledged anything real, and I did not respond, not because I hated him, but because I did not owe him a response. And the truth is, apology is not a key that unlocks the door, it is just a knock, and sometimes the door stays closed, and I had already chosen peace on the other side. And I watched Leo decorate our living room with tiny pumpkins and paper leaves, and I thought, this is what family looks like, not perfection, not blood, not obligation, but love, the kind you choose, the kind you nurture, the kind you protect. And I had finally chosen right, and I had finally chosen us. By the time the 1-year anniversary of that Christmas party came around, the air had shifted, not just outside with the colder winds returning, but inside me as well. There was no lingering bitterness, no hidden hope of reconciliation, no temptation to peek at their social media or reread old texts. Had all dissolved into something quieter, something final, like the last page of a book you do not plan to reread. And Leo was thriving in ways that made my heart swell beyond what I thought possible. He had won a small poetry contest at school, nothing extravagant, just a handwritten certificate and a little round of applause from classmates, but to him it meant everything. And when he showed me the paper, I hugged him and told him how proud I was, and he whispered, "I did it for you, Mom." And I almost cried right there in the school hallway, because I knew what he meant. He was not just winning that day. He was healing, and I was too, in our own quiet, deliberate ways. And I had not spoken a word to Brenda or Joseph or Alicia or Scott in all those months, and the silence was not cold or lonely. It was safe and rich and nourishing, like the calm after a storm that had raged for too many years. And the condo I placed my parents in had become exactly what I intended, a comfortable cage, a quiet, distant structure with no access, no leeching, no drama. And I paid the maintenance fees on time every month, not out of obligation, but out of strategy, because I wanted no gaps, no excuses, no legal room for them. Twist the narrative. I was giving them exactly what they needed to live, and absolutely nothing more. And they knew better than to test me again. And the sale of the house had been clean, profitable, and quick, and the profits had been folded back into Leo's trust like layers of protection and power, all designed to ensure that nothing and no one could ever steal from him again. And every decision I made went through that filter. Will this protect my son? Will this honor his future? Will this keep us whole? And anything that did not meet those standards was cut. And as the holidays approached again, I noticed a shift in Leo too, not the usual sadness or confusion, not the nervous questions about why we were not going to Grandma's, but a quiet acceptance, a peace he had earned. And when I asked him what he wanted for Christmas, he smiled and said, "Just us and maybe pancakes again." And I told him, "Absolutely." And I took time off from work, real time, no emails, no meetings, no calls. And we spent the entire week decorating our home with gold and red and little paper ornaments he made himself, and each one had a word written in crayon: peace, strength, love, hope. And I knew he meant them, and we spent Christmas Eve making cookies and reading stories, and when he fell asleep beside the fireplace, I looked around our apartment and felt something I had never felt growing up, not fear, not pressure, not expectation, but joy, and it was not performative or polished or loud. It was simple and true and completely ours, and on Christmas morning I gave Leo his gifts, and among them was a new set of books, ones designed for children with dyslexia, with fonts that helped him focus and little supportive messages in the margins. And he opened them slowly, gently, and when he realized what they were, he looked at me with wide eyes and whispered, "You remembered?" And I laughed and said, "Of course I did." And he said, "I thought maybe you forgot, since I don't struggle as much now." And I told him, "I will always remember the things that matter to you, because they matter to me." And we sat together reading, and when he stumbled I helped him, and when he got it right I cheered, and I knew without a doubt that this was the only kind of Christmas I ever wanted again. And far away in that retirement community, Brenda and Joseph were probably sitting in silence, or maybe wrapped in 1,000 lies, trying to explain to each other why their golden child was not calling, why the money had dried up, why the world they had built on my back had collapsed. And I did not care, because their silence was the gift I gave myself. And when January came, Leo returned to school stronger, more confident, more aware of who he was, and I returned to work with new energy and new boundaries. And I declined an invitation to an awards ceremony where I was being honored because it fell on the same day as Leo's school play. And when someone from my board questioned the choice, I told them the truth: my son comes first, and if that ever becomes a problem, I will start my own board. And they nodded and said nothing, because people understand strength even when they do not respect it, and especially when they fear it. And I had become a woman people did not just respect, they feared, not because I was cruel or cold, but because I was clear. And I no longer played the game, and clarity is terrifying to people who only know manipulation. And one day in early spring, I ran into someone from the old world, an old friend of Alicia's, a woman who used to nod politely at me at family parties while whispering behind my back. And she was at a bookstore holding a stack of self-help books, and when she saw me she froze for a second and then smiled, that tight, strained smile people wear when they do not know which version of you they are going to get. And she said, "I heard things got a little messy last year." And I said, "They got clean." And she blinked and said, "Oh well, I'm sorry it had to come to that." And I said, "I am not, I'm grateful." And she shifted uncomfortably and said, "I don't know how you did it." And I looked her in the eyes and said I remembered who I was, and then I walked away. And it was not cruel, it was necessary. And I went home and told Leo the story, and he laughed and said, "You're kind of a superhero." And I said, "Maybe just the mom kind." And he said, "That's the best kind." And that night I looked at myself in the mirror and did not see the woman I used to be, not the pleaser, not the fixer, not the ATM. I saw someone whole, someone fierce, someone worthy. And I realized that walking away from that family did not destroy me. It revealed me, and all the energy I had once poured into trying to make them love me, I now poured into loving myself and my son. And that kind of love builds things that no lie can tear down and no thief can touch. And as summer approached and the days grew longer, Leo asked if we could write a story together, and I said absolutely. And every night we sat at the dining table, crafting a tale of a boy and his brave mother who sailed through storms and fought dragons and found treasure in unexpected places. And at the end of the story, the boy looked up at the stars and said, "I'm glad we left the bad castle." And the mother said, "Me too." And I realized then that I was not just rewriting my life, I was writing a new one for him, one where love is safe, where truth is honored, where family is not defined by blood, but by how we show up and stay and grow. And the greatest revenge I ever took was not slamming doors or cutting cards or exposing lies. It was building a life so full of peace and purpose that the people who once used me no longer existed in my world, not even as shadows. And as we finished our story, Leo leaned on my shoulder and said, "Do you think people like the bad ones ever learn?" And I said, "Maybe, but that's not our job." And he nodded and said, "Yeah. Our job is to write better stories." And I smiled and said, "Exactly." The first real test of our strength came during Leo's school summer carnival, where families were invited to join their children for games, food, and performances. And as I stood in the crowd watching Leo play a tug-of-war game with his classmates, I saw a face I had not seen since that final blow out Year and a half ago, Scott, Alicia's husband, tall, tan, dressed in his usual smug golf attire, talking to another parent from Leo's class. And my stomach clenched for a second because for a flash I remembered the old cycle, the way these people used to orbit my life, steal my energy, manipulate moments, until I felt like the outsider and they were the center. And now here he was in my space, my new world, and Leo had not noticed yet, so I stayed still, watched from the side, and waited, and sure enough Scott eventually turned and saw me. And I saw the exact moment recognition hit him, the pause, the flicker of hesitation, the shift in posture like a man trying to decide whether to confront or retreat, and then he made the mistake, he walked over. I braced myself, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to make sure I would not lower myself to the level of petty that once used to haunt me. He said, well, long time, and I said not long enough, and he blinked, clearly taken aback, and said, look, I don't want any drama, I just wanted to say hi, and I said you just did, and now you can go, and he laughed nervously, and said, you know, Alicia's been really broken up about everything, and I said that's her work to do, not mine, and he said, you don't think maybe you overreacted cutting everyone off like that? And I looked him in the eyes and said, if I had overreacted you'd be in court, not at a school carnival. And he stopped smiling then, and I could see the chill travel through him because I meant every word. And I was done pretending to play nice with people who never showed up when it counted, and he said, look, I know things got messy, but we're family, and I said no, we were relatives, and now we're nothing, and he said Leo doesn't have to suffer because of what happened, and I said Leo is thriving because I removed all of you, and that's when he had nothing left to say, and he turned and walked away, and I stood there breathing steadily, grounding myself back in the moment. And when Leo came running toward me with a prize ribbon in his hand, I smiled like nothing had happened and hugged him tightly and said, I'm so proud of you. And that was the truth, because that moment was the proof I needed that I had become someone I could trust with my own peace. And a few weeks later, the fallout from that brief encounter arrived in the form of a text from an unknown number. The message said, please, I just want to talk, I miss you, I miss Leo, and I knew it was Alicia. The words were too soft, too pleading, and I deleted the message without replying because I had already given everyone more than one chance, and not one of them used it wisely. And that summer Leo and I traveled for the first time, just the two of us, a short road trip to a quiet beach town where we spent the days collecting shells, eating ice cream, and building sandcastles that washed away with the tide but still felt like victories. And I watched him laugh in the waves, fearless, free, and I thought, this is the boy I am raising, a boy who knows his worth, not because someone told him, but because someone showed him. And every night we wrote in our travel journal a memory, a funny quote, a thing we learned. And Leo wrote, today I saw a jellyfish and it was cool, but Mom says to never touch one. And I laughed because even in freedom I was teaching him caution. And we came back sun-kissed and closer than ever, and in the fall he started a new school, one with better resources and smaller classes, and within a month his teacher called me to say Leo was one of the most insightful students she'd ever met, and that he had an emotional maturity most adults did not. And I told her thank you and cried after hanging up, because she saw what I saw and what others had ignored for so long. And meanwhile, the old world tried once again to creep in, a letter, this time from Joseph, handwritten, full of manipulative half-apologies and veiled accusations, saying he wished I would let go of my resentment, that family was everything, that they missed me and Leo, and wanted to make things right. And I read it once, then placed it in a box where I kept other failed apologies, and never looked at it again, because forgiveness without change is just another form of manipulation. And I had no space left for recycled pain. And on Leo's birthday that year, I threw him a party, not a huge one, but one filled with love and people who saw him fully. And my friends came, people who had supported me through the darkest times and brought their kids and gifts and laughter. And Leo looked around and said, I like these people, they're kind. And I said, yes, they are. And he said, can they be our new family? And I said, they already are. And that night, after everyone left and the candles had been blown and the wrapping paper had been tossed, Leo sat next to me on the couch and said, I'm really happy. And I asked why, and he said, because we're safe. And I realized then how deep the old wounds had gone, how aware he had been even when we thought he was just a kid in the corner, how much he had noticed the coldness, the exclusion, the moments where love was withheld like a punishment. And now he knew the difference, and that knowledge was his protection and mine. And one chilly November morning, as we walked to school, he stopped suddenly, pointed to a tree, and said, "It looks like it's letting go." And I said, "What?" And he said, "The tree, look, it's dropping all its leaves like it knows it can't hold on forever." And I said, "That's true." And he said, "Maybe that's what we did, we let go." And I nodded and said, "Yes, baby, we did." And the letting go made space for everything that's growing now. And as the anniversary of the infamous Christmas party approached again, I felt no dread, only certainty. Because we had not just survived, we had rebuilt, and this new life was not a patchwork fix, it was a fortress, and Leo was stronger, kinder, sharper, and I was more myself than I had ever been. And when a distant cousin emailed to say the family was trying to plan a reunion, and asked if I wanted to be included, I replied no and blocked the address, because sometimes the most radical act of love is saying no and meaning it. And in that quiet, decisive no, I found my yes to everything that mattered. And when I tucked Leo in that night, he said, "Will we always be just us?" And I said, "Maybe, or maybe someday we'll have more people, but only the ones who deserve to be here." And he smiled and said, "Then we're good." And I kissed his forehead and said, "Yes, we are." The morning sun poured in through the window, and for once I let it hit my face without rushing to move or hide from the light. I had nowhere to be, and no one waiting to pull me into their drama, which felt like freedom in its simplest form. I got out of bed slowly, like my body was finally catching up with the pace of my spirit. I made tea in silence and watched the steam rise while my thoughts wandered to everything that had brought me here, all the pain, the betrayal, the moments I had swallowed my truth just to keep peace that never truly existed. And I felt something shift deep inside me, not loud transformation, but a quiet certainty that I would never go back to being the girl who stayed quiet just to make others comfortable around mid-morning. I opened my inbox and saw a new message from Jasmine. She had written a long apology again. This time she said she understood if I needed more time, but she hoped one day we could talk, not to argue or defend, but to simply understand each other. I read every word slowly, and though part of me wanted to delete it without thinking, I found myself reading it again, this time with less anger and more curiosity. Was she really trying to change, or was this another performance crafted by guilt? Only time would tell, but for the first time I didn't feel triggered by her message, and that told me more about my healing than her words ever could. I closed the laptop without replying and went for a walk with Leo. We strolled down the park path where the trees were just starting to bloom again, and the air smelled like possibility. He talked about a project at school where he had to build a miniature city, and he wanted me to help design the park, and I laughed and said, "Only if I get to name it." And he said, "Deal." And in that moment I realized how full my life was, even if it didn't look like the life I thought I'd have. I had peace, I had purpose, I had my son. And weeks passed, and Jasmine wrote again and again, each time softer, more sincere, or so it seemed, until one day she sent a photo. It was of a necklace, the one I had given her for her graduation, a silver pendant shaped like a compass with a tiny engraving on the back that said, "Always find your true north." I'd saved for weeks to buy it, and she had worn it only a handful of times before it vanished from her jewelry box. I had always wondered what happened to it, and now here it was in my inbox, with her message saying, "I kept it all these years. I didn't know how to wear it back then, but I do now." And I thought about it for days, whether I should reply, whether I should give her a chance to speak her truth. And one evening, after putting Leo to bed, I sat on the couch and wrote her back nothing dramatic, just one line, "I hope you found your north." And she replied within minutes, "I'm still looking, but I finally know which direction." And from there a slow, gentle dialogue began, nothing forced, no dramatic reconciliation, just cautious honesty. She asked about Leo. I told her he was thriving. She didn't push for contact, she just listened, and over time I found myself softening, not forgetting, not excusing, just letting go of the sharp edges and choosing not to carry the weight anymore. And during this time I realized that healing isn't always a clean break. Sometimes it's a return to old wounds. Not to reopen them, but to see how far you've come since you were bleeding. And I started therapy again, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand my patterns, especially the parts of me that still flinched at love or backed away from closeness. And my therapist said something that stuck with me. She said, "Your boundaries are not punishments, they are evidence of your growth." And I began to hold that truth close every time I felt guilt for the distance I had created. And then one afternoon I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to, and it was my father, his voice older, wearier, but unmistakable. He said, "I heard you've been talking to Jasmine." And I said yes, and he paused like he was unsure what he had the right to say. And then he said, "She told me you've changed," and I said I did. And he said, "Well, I was hoping maybe I could change too." And I said, "That's up to you." And he said, "Can we talk? I won't ask for anything else." And something in his voice sounded real, not performative, not manipulative, just tired and maybe sorry. And I said, "Okay." And we met a week later in a small coffee shop, far from where anyone would recognize us, and he looked thinner, more fragile, like life had humbled him, and he didn't try to hug me or pretend things were normal. He just sat down and said, "I messed up," and I didn't say anything because I needed to see where he would go with that. And he said I was raised by a man who never showed love, and I thought I was doing better than him, but I see now I wasn't. And I said I never needed perfect, I just needed present. And he nodded and said, "I know, and I'm sorry, and I don't expect anything from you." I just needed to say it, and I believed him, not because he said the right things, but because he didn't ask for anything in return, and that was new. And we talked for almost 2 hours, not about the past, not in circles, but about real things like what makes a good parent, what I've learned from raising Leo, what he regrets, what he fears. And when we parted, he didn't ask to see Leo. He just said, "Tell him." I said, "Happy birthday, if it's coming up," and I said it was in a few months, and he smiled and said he's lucky to have you, and I walked away with tears in my eyes, not because I forgave him, but because I finally felt like I didn't need anything from him, not validation, not affection, not answers, and that freedom was everything. And that night I told Leo I had seen Grandpa, and he said, "Do I have to see him?" And I said, "Only if you want to." And he said, "I don't think I do yet." And I said, "That's okay." And he said, "Maybe one day." And I said maybe, and left it there because I wasn't going to force closure, connection. And in the days that followed, I realized I was no longer carrying the need to prove anything to anyone, not my worth, not my strength, not my motherhood. And that meant I could choose what to rebuild and what to let remain in ruins. And when Jasmine asked if she could send Leo a birthday gift, I said yes, but no expectations, and she respected that and sent a small, thoughtful package, a book about space, and a handwritten card that said, "I hope you always reach for the stars." And Leo opened it with mild curiosity, but didn't ask who it was from, and I didn't offer, and I let the moment pass quietly, because not everything needs to be a lesson or a milestone. Some things can just be simple. And when I sat down that night and looked around my apartment, the same one I had fought to keep, the same walls that had once felt like a prison and now felt like a palace, I realized I had done what they said I couldn't. I had built a full, rich, meaningful life from the pieces they left behind. And I was not angry anymore, just aware, and maybe that was the final stage of healing, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just awareness and peace, and the strength to keep going on my terms. The weeks kept rolling forward like waves I could not stop, but for once I wasn't trying to hold them back. I let them come, and I let them go because I had finally learned that life didn't wait for anyone, and peace didn't come from controlling every outcome. It came from letting go of the need to win every argument or prove every point. My days became filled with more of the simple things, the kind of moments no one claps for, but that matter the most. I woke up early and walked with Leo before school. We talked about the stars and dinosaurs, and why some cookies are better when you freeze them. I took pictures of him laughing, not for social media, but for myself, so I could remember that joy was real, even if it was built on top of pain. I started painting again, something I had abandoned long before when survival was my only focus. I painted the sky, the sea, my memories reimagined as soft swirls and wild colors, and sometimes I cried while I painted because art was where I had always hidden my truth, even from myself. And as the seasons began to shift, I noticed how my body no longer braced for impact at the sound of my phone buzzing. I no longer expected guilt or shame or disappointment every time a message arrived. Sometimes it was just a friend, sometimes it was Jasmine, sometimes it was silence, and all of it was okay. And one day Leo came home with a flyer for a school art show. He wanted to submit a drawing, and he asked if I would help, and I said only if I get to pick the music while we draw, and he laughed and said deal, so we spent an entire Saturday sprawled across the living room floor with crayons, markers, and old paint. He drew a rocket ship blasting through the sky with bright yellow flames and smiling stars, and I painted beside him, not to show him how to do it right, but just to join him in the joy of creating. And when he turned to me and said, "You're really good at this, Mom," I felt something loosen in my chest. I had been so many things, but being good at something for no one else's benefit, but my own, felt new and sacred. And around that time, Jasmine messaged again. This time she asked if she could come visit, not to stay, not to overstep, just to bring something. She said she had something of mine I deserved to have back, and I hesitated because the last time she had crossed my doorstep, it ended in pain and shouting, but something in me was curious, maybe ready not for reconciliation but for reclaiming, so I said yes with boundaries. I told her Leo would not be there, and this was not about rebuilding anything, this was closure, if anything, and she agreed. And on a rainy Thursday she arrived at my door holding a small worn box. It was the kind you find in antique shops, wrapped in old ribbon, and it smelled like cedar and thyme, and inside was a collection of things I had thought were lost forever: letters, drawings, a small toy lion I had as a child, and at the bottom a photo of me and my mom and Jasmine from a family trip when I was 10 years old. I was laughing. Jasmine was holding my hand. Our mother was mid-blink but smiling, and I stared at that photo like it was a portal to a version of us that once existed before the fractures, before the favoritism. And I asked her why now, and she said, because I finally realized what I stole from you when I pretended you were the problem and not the one carrying all of ours. And I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. And she didn't cry, she didn't beg, she just sat there quietly, letting the silence speak for what words never could. And before she left she said, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I'm working every day to be someone worth forgiving." And I said, "That's your journey," and she nodded and left. And I sat on the floor surrounded by memories that once hurt and now just hummed with soft ache, not pain, not anymore. And later that night I told Leo I had seen Aunt Jasmine, and he asked why, and I said because sometimes people try to do better after they realize they hurt someone. And he said, "Do you believe her?" And I said, "I don't know yet." And he said, "That's fair," and I smiled because my son was learning what it meant to hold space for complex feelings, something I never learned until much later. And a few weeks later I got a call from Leo's school. They were having a holiday performance, and they wanted parents to bring something cultural for the potluck. And I remembered how my mom used to make a dish called sweet snow, a mix of coconut milk, rice, and cardamom that she said came from her grandmother, and I had never learned the recipe because she always shooed me out of the kitchen. But I decided to try anyway. I called Jasmine and asked if she remembered, and to my surprise she did. She walked me through it step by step, and I scribbled notes while Leo stirred the pot, and the smell brought back so many memories, both good and difficult, but mostly warm. And when we brought it to the school event, the other kids devoured it, and Leo stood proudly beside me telling everyone, "My mom made this, it's from our family." And in that moment I felt like I had finally reclaimed something sacred, something that had been buried under years of shame and rejection. And I realized that healing isn't just about cutting people out, it's also about choosing what parts of your past you want to carry forward and make your own. And that night Leo fell asleep with a smile on his face, and I sat in the quiet living room looking at the stars outside the window, thinking about how far I had come. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't desperate to be seen or heard or validated. I was content in my skin, in my choices, in my boundaries, and I knew that whatever came next, whether Jasmine stayed in my life or drifted again, whether my parents ever truly changed or just faded from view, I would be okay because I had built something real out of rubble, and that something was enough. And when Leo asked a few days later if he could invite Aunt Jasmine to his next art show, I paused and said, "If you want to," and he said, "I think I do." And I told him we could talk about it more later, but that I was proud of him for speaking his truth. And as we sat on the couch watching a holiday movie with twinkling lights and hot cocoa, I thought back to that Christmas party, the one that started it all, the one where I was told My son didn't belong, and I smiled not out of bitterness but out of gratitude, because that rejection forced me to choose myself and my son fully, and in doing so I found everything I never knew. I was allowed to have peace, purpose, love, and most of all freedom. The next few weeks unfolded with a quiet rhythm I had never experienced before, a kind of calm that didn't come from things being perfect, but from finally being okay with imperfection. My days were filled with school drop-offs, grocery runs, late-night story times, and quiet mornings with coffee in hand while Leo built towers from his Legos beside me. The absence of drama felt like a miracle, and for the first time I allowed myself to enjoy it fully without guilt or fear that it would be taken from me. I began reconnecting with parts of myself that had gone dormant: hobbies, laughter, spontaneous dancing in the kitchen with Leo just because the right song came on. I was no longer trying to impress anyone, not my parents, not Jasmine, not the world. I was just living, and it felt like freedom. I had begun attending a small weekend art workshop, nothing formal, just a group of women gathering to paint and talk and drink tea. It was the first space I entered where no one knew my family story or my past. They only knew me as the woman who liked bold colors and painted wild skies. And one afternoon, while I was working on a canvas of swirling reds and deep blues, a woman named Claire leaned over and said, "There's a lot of power in your work." And I looked at her and smiled, not because I needed the praise, but because it felt good to be seen in a way that had nothing to do with my pain. Around the same time, Leo came home with a permission slip for a winter field trip, and I read it with a mix of excitement and caution. The trip was to a local museum, followed by an outdoor skating activity, and they needed chaperones, and Leo had written in the margin, "Mom, please come if you can," and it struck me that he still wanted me there, not because he was scared, but because he liked having me around. That meant more than any apology I could ever receive from my family, so I signed up, and the day of the trip I bundled up in layers, helped tie Leo's scarf, and hopped on the school bus with a group of third graders who had more energy than I thought possible. Before noon, we spent the day learning about history, looking at ancient fossils, laughing at silly exhibits, and when we finally made it to the ice rink, Leo took his first few steps on the ice with wobbly legs and determination on his face. I watched him fall, get up, fall again, and then finally glide a few feet with a triumphant grin, and I clapped louder than anyone, and he turned to me and shouted, "I did it, Mom." And in that moment I realized just how much resilience my son carried, and how much of it had come from watching me keep going through my own slips and falls. That night, after the field trip, Leo fell asleep early, and I sat by the window watching the snow begin to fall, and I thought about the version of myself that used to beg for a seat at the family table, a place in my parents' hearts, a chance to be seen and valued, not just tolerated, and I felt a soft sadness for her, but also pride because she had kept walking. She had become me, and I wasn't waiting for invitations anymore. I was building my own table, my own traditions. And then came a message from Jasmine again. She said she was planning a quiet Christmas Eve dinner at her place, just a few people, mostly her colleagues and a few friends she had invited over. She asked if I wanted to stop by just for dessert, just to see the decorations and maybe share some memories from childhood. And I stared at that message for a long time, because the idea of being back in that kind of setting brought up so much. It wasn't that I didn't believe she was trying, I did, but trust wasn't something that returned with words, it returned with consistency and time, and even then I wasn't sure I needed it. But then Leo looked up at me and asked, "Are we doing anything special on Christmas Eve?" And I paused and said, "Not yet." And he said, "I think we should eat cookies and wear pajamas all day and maybe watch that movie with the train and the hot chocolate." And I laughed and said, "That sounds like a perfect plan." And he nodded seriously and said, "Okay, but we need matching pajamas." And suddenly the idea of a quiet night in with just us felt better than any party ever could. And so I messaged Jasmine back and said thank you, but I think we're starting a new tradition this year. And she replied, "I understand, maybe next time." And that was it. No guilt, no pushback. And that silence told me more than any apology ever could. She was finally learning to respect my no, and that was start. And so on Christmas Eve, Leo and I wore matching pajamas with snowflakes, made sugar cookies, danced to holiday songs, and watched movies until we both fell asleep on the couch. and in the soft glow of the Christmas lights, I felt a peace I had never known growing up because it came from within, not from approval or belonging or performing. It came from choosing myself and my son over everything else. And on Christmas morning, we opened presents slowly, one at a time, savoring each moment. Leo's eyes lit up at a new science kit and a stack of books about space, and he turned to me and said, "This is the best Christmas ever," and I knew he meant it, not because of the gifts, but because of the love and warmth surrounding him. I had created a home where he felt safe, celebrated, and wanted, and that was everything I had ever wanted for myself and never received. And as the day went on, I got a message from one of the art women, Claire. She invited me to a small New Year's brunch, just women, no pressure, no expectations, and I said yes, not because I needed to be social, but because I wanted to surround myself with people who saw me as I was, not as I used to be. And as I looked around our tiny living room, the trees slightly crooked, the wrapping paper still scattered, the smell of cinnamon in the air, I felt more complete than I ever had in any big house or fancy celebration. And later that night, I pulled out my old sketchbook, the one I had stopped using years ago, and started sketching again, not for anyone else but just for me. And as I filled page after page, I thought about how healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy and slow and filled with pauses, but it was happening, and I was proud of how far I had come. I didn't need my parents to see me anymore because I saw myself clearly, and I didn't need Jasmine's validation because I had my own voice, and I didn't need a perfect life. I just needed a real one, and that's what I was building, one day at a time, one choice at a time. And when Leo crawled into my lap that night and whispered, "Thanks for making Christmas awesome, Mom," I held him close and whispered back, "Thanks for making it mean something." And in that quiet exchange, I felt the full weight of everything I had lost and everything I had gained, and I knew without a doubt that I had made it to the other side, not without scars, but with strength, with love, and with a future I was finally excited to live. The new year arrived quietly, with no fanfare, no loud parties, no grand resolutions, just a gentle sunrise, and the soft breathing of Leo, curled beside me on the couch, still wrapped in his snowflake pajamas. The first morning of the year felt different, not because anything magical had happened at midnight, but because I woke up without dread in my chest. I made pancakes with extra syrup, Leo's favorite, and we talked about what we wanted to do this year, not goals or achievements, but things that made us feel alive. He said he wanted to build the biggest Lego spaceship ever and maybe learn how to make real hot chocolate, and I told him I wanted to paint something big, maybe a mural or something messy, and he grinned and said, "Can I help?" And I said, "Always," and we pinky swore over sticky forks that we'd do it together. A few days later, I received a package on my doorstep with no return label, just my name in careful handwriting, and when I opened it I found a small wooden ornament carved into the shape of a snowflake with Leo's name engraved in the center, and underneath it was a short note from my mother. She had written, "I saw this and thought of you. I know we can't undo the past, but maybe we can start with something small." And it stunned me more than anything she had said to my face, because it wasn't dramatic or laced with guilt. It was quiet, almost uncertain, and it felt real. I didn't know what to do with it, so I placed the ornament on the mantel next to a candle Leo had made in school, and let it be just that, a small gesture, nothing more and nothing less. A week later, Jasmine called again, this time with a different tone. She said she had been seeing a therapist, and for the first time she wasn't saying it to impress me or get a reaction. She just mentioned it casually, like someone saying they'd started going to the gym, and she said, "It's hard. I'm realizing a lot of things I never wanted to admit." And I said, "I'm glad you're doing that." And she didn't push or ask for anything else. She just wanted me to know. And that was enough. Months passed, and the rhythm of life kept moving. Leo grew taller, his laughter louder, and I found myself breathing deeper, sleeping better, trusting the peace that had settled in our home. The art classes grew too, and I was asked to teach one weekend, and though I was nervous, I said yes. And the first time I stood in front of a group of strangers talking about brush strokes and color theory, I realized I wasn't shaking, I wasn't shrinking, I was standing tall and using my voice in ways I had forgotten I could. And after class, Claire came up and said you were meant for this, and I believed her, because for once I didn't feel like an imposter, I felt like a woman who had earned every scar and turned it into something beautiful. One evening in early spring, Leo came home with a school flyer crumpled in his backpack. It was about a family day picnic with games, music, and a potluck. He handed it to me and said, "Will you come, and can we bring brownies?" And I laughed and said, "Of course." And on the day of the picnic, the sun was warm, the grass freshly cut, and Leo ran wild with his friends, while I laid out a blanket and passed around brownies to kids with chocolate on their faces. And one of the moms sat beside me and said, "Your son is such a joy," and I smiled, because he really was. And when Leo ran back to me, dirt on his knees and a leaf in his hair, he collapsed into my lap and said, "This is the best day ever," and I kissed the top of his head and said, "Me too." And then, just before the school year ended, I got a surprise email from Leo's teacher. She wanted nominate him for a kindness award, something given to students who showed compassion, leadership, and inclusion. And she wrote, "He's the kind of kid who makes others feel safe, seen, and valued." And I cried reading that, not because of the award, but because it meant that despite everything, he had grown into a person I was proud of, someone strong, soft, kind, and brave. And I knew that didn't come from being shielded from pain, but from learning how to walk through it with love. And when he got the award at the school assembly and looked out into the crowd to find me, I waved like crazy. And when he found me, he beamed and held up his little certificate like it was the Nobel Prize. And in that moment I felt everything settle, every doubt, every wound, every what if, because this was the proof that I had done something right. And after the assembly, Jasmine texted me. She had heard about the award. Someone at the school, she wrote, "I'm proud of him and of you." And for the first time I didn't roll my eyes or feel angry. I just said thank you, because sometimes growth looks like small, quiet exchanges that don't hurt and don't demand more than they give. And that summer we took our first real vacation. Just Leo and me. We drove to a nearby lake, rented a cabin, and spent days swimming, eating marshmallows, and watching stars. And one night, Leo said, "Mom, this is what happy feels like, right?" And I said, "Yes, baby, it really is." And as we lay under the sky full of stars, I thought about how far we had come from that Christmas night, from the party we weren't invited to, from the cold faces and closed doors. And now here we were in the warmth of a new chapter, not perfect, but ours, and that made all the difference. Near the end of summer, Jasmine reached out again, this time asking if she could join one of my art classes. She said she had started painting a little in therapy and thought maybe it would help. And I said yes with caution, not because I didn't want her there, but because I needed her to come, as she was not as the version she used to perform. And when she showed up that Saturday in a hoodie, no makeup, hair in a messy bun, and asked what canvas to use, I nodded and said, "Take whichever speaks to you." And she sat quietly painting slow, uncertain strokes, and I let her be there, not as a sister trying to fix things, but as a woman trying to find herself. And at the end of class, she held up her canvas, and it was rough, clumsy, but full of emotion. And she said, "I think I like this." And I said, "Good, keep doing it." And when she hugged me goodbye, it wasn't tight or desperate, just a light touch that said thank you, and I appreciated it, because healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's in the gentle moments. Silent forgiveness, the space you give each other to grow. And by the time autumn rolled around, I had finished my mural. It was painted on the side of the community center where we held our classes, a swirl of colors, shapes, faces, and light. And in the corner I had signed it with Leo's name too, because he had helped. And the day it was unveiled, a small crowd gathered, and someone asked what it meant. And I said, "It's about resilience, about finding beauty in brokenness." And they nodded like they understood. And Leo looked up at me and said, "We made that." And I said, "Yes, baby, we did." And I knew then that no matter what came next, we would be okay, not because the past had disappeared, but because we had chosen to keep moving forward, one brushstroke at a time. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around again, I found myself thinking less about what had been lost and more about what I had built. Leo and I had our traditions now, ones that were ours alone. And that sense of freedom was something I never knew I needed so badly. We roasted marshmallows on stovetop. Instead of baking pies, we danced in the living room to old jazz records I had found at a flea market, and we made a gratitude board filled with drawings instead of words. Leo drew a dinosaur holding a heart and said, "This is for my mom because she is strong like a T-Rex," and I laughed until I cried. We were invited to a neighbor's dinner that year, a kind couple who had taken a liking to Leo and always waved from across the fence. They had no children of their own, and said our laughter made the street feel alive, so we joined them for turkey, mashed potatoes, and stories by the fireplace. At one point, Leo leaned into me and whispered, "This is better than Christmas at Grandma's," and I didn't respond. I just squeezed his hand and smiled, not because I wanted revenge or validation, but because he was finally seeing love where it really existed. As the end of the year drew near, I got a letter in the mail from my father, handwritten and shaky. It was the first time he had reached out directly since the Christmas party almost a year ago. He wrote that he had been wrong about many things, that he had spent too much of his life chasing appearances and not enough time asking himself what truly mattered. He didn't make excuses, but he also didn't beg. He just acknowledged the pain he had caused and said, if there was ever a path forward, he hoped to find it slowly. I didn't know how to respond at first. I sat with the letter for days, sometimes rereading it, sometimes putting it away, sometimes wanting to rip it to pieces, but I didn't, because part of me could tell it was written from a place of real reflection and not manipulation. Jasmine came by the studio around that time, her face calmer, her voice less sharp, and she said, "Dad wrote you too, didn't he?" And I nodded. She said, "He's been different lately, softer," and I said, "People change when they want to, not when they're forced," and she agreed and didn't push me to respond, just said, "Whatever you choose, it's valid," and I appreciated that for once my choices were not being judged, just held in neutral space. Leo had been asking questions about his grandparents again, not with bitterness but with curiosity. He remembered certain things, like the way Grandpa used to whistle or how Grandma's house smelled like cinnamon, and I answered as honestly as I could. I told him people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes leave cracks in walls, but that didn't mean he had to carry the weight of those bricks himself. He seemed to understand in the way children often do, more deeply than adults give them credit for, and he said, "Maybe we can see them one day," and I said, "Maybe, but only if it feels safe and kind," and he said okay, and went back to building his Lego castle. Like the conversation hadn't just carried the weight of generations, I finally wrote back to my father weeks later. It was a short letter. I told him I appreciated his words, but I wasn't ready for visits or calls, and that if he truly wanted a relationship with Leo, me, he'd have to respect our pace, not his. And I ended it with, "I hope you keep healing, for you, not for anyone else," and mailed it without expecting a reply. I didn't get one for a long time, and that was okay, because I hadn't written it for closure or for forgiveness, but to reclaim my voice, the one that had been drowned out for so long by guilt and people-pleasing. When Christmas came around again, Leo and I decorated our apartment with strings of lights that blinked like tiny stars. He asked if we were going to Grandma's, and I said no, this year we're making our own magic, and he didn't seem sad. He just asked, "Can we invite our neighbors?" And I said of course, and so we did. We invited the older couple next door, the single mom from 2 floors down, and even the grumpy man from across the hall, who always pretended not to hear us, and to my surprise everyone came and brought something sweet and warm and real, and our small apartment glowed with more joy than any mansion could hold. At one point someone put on Christmas music, and Leo pulled me to dance, and as we twirled in our socks and laughed, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living fully, openly, without fear. And when the party ended and the dishes were stacked high and the candles burned low, Leo curled up beside me on the couch and said, "This is the best Christmas ever," and I kissed his forehead and said, "It really is, baby," and meant every word, because we weren't trying to fit into someone else's tradition anymore. We were building something new from scratch, made of truth, love, and a little bit of chaos. In early January, I got another letter from my father. It was even shorter than the first. He said he understood and would wait, and that he had started volunteering at a local shelter because he wanted to learn how listen without fixing, and how to be useful without being praised. I didn't reply, but I smiled and placed the letter in a drawer, not because I was ready to forgive, but because I was willing to witness someone else's growth without needing to control the outcome. Jasmine started attending my art classes regularly by then, and she had become surprisingly gentle in her presence, not overly apologetic, just steady and real. She brought tea, sometimes helped clean up, and once even complimented another student on their work, without making it about herself. She was changing in ways I never thought possible, and I think part of her knew it wasn't about earning her spot back in my life, but about becoming someone she could live with, and that made all the difference. One afternoon after class, she stayed behind and asked if I ever thought we'd be like we used to be, and I said no, because we're not who we used to be, and that's not a bad thing. And she nodded and said maybe that's better, and I agreed. Leo noticed too. He asked why Aunt Jasmine was being nicer, and I told him sometimes people take a long time to learn how to love the right way, and he said I'm glad she's learning because I like her better now. And I said me too, baby, me too. And the truth was I didn't miss the version of my family I used to long for. I didn't ache for the perfect holidays or the approval that had once felt like air I needed to breathe. Instead, I cherished the quiet mornings, the honest conversations, the freedom to say no without explanation and yes without fear. By spring, Leo was flourishing in school. He had started writing little stories and poems, and one day brought home a piece that said, "My mom is like sunshine and pancakes. She makes me feel warm and full," and I cried reading it, because that was the kind of legacy I wanted. Not wealth or status, but a child who felt safe enough to compare love to breakfast food and sunshine. I framed it and hung it above my desk, where I could see it every day as a reminder of what truly mattered, not who accepted us or what parties we were invited to, but the love we built in our small sacred space. And when I looked at that paper, I saw not just Leo's words, but the journey we had walked together through shame, rejection, healing, and joy, and I knew without a doubt that we were right where we were meant to be. The days were growing longer as spring melted into early summer, and with each sunrise I felt the weight that used to press on my chest becoming lighter, not because everything was perfect, but because I had stopped expecting perfection from people who had always offered conditions instead of compassion. Leo had grown so much since that winter, his curiosity sharper, his laughter louder, and his questions braver. He asked me once, "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa still think kids ruin parties?" And I answered honestly, "I think they thought a lot of wrong things, but maybe they are learning to think differently now." And he nodded like that was enough for him, because children understand forgiveness in ways adults often forget. He had begun sending drawings to his grandparents on his own accord, slipping them into envelopes with stamps I helped him buy, and writing little notes in his best handwriting. Once he wrote to my father, "I hope you are happy today, love, Leo." And when I saw it, I nearly cried, not from sadness, but from awe at how his little heart had room for softness. Even after everything that had happened, I didn't stop him. I didn't censor him. I just told him to always share his truth the way it felt right for him. And in those moments I realized the healing we were doing wasn't just about cutting people off. It was about teaching Leo that he could set his own boundaries and still hold space for hope. Jasmine continued to show up, not just to my classes, but to life in a new way. She called on Leo's birthday and asked if she could drop off a gift, just a small gesture. She said no expectations, and I agreed. She came with a wrapped box and a genuine smile. And when Leo opened it and found a set of watercolor paints, he looked at me for approval, and I nodded, and he thanked her and asked if she would stay for cake, and she did, quietly, respectfully, without trying to center herself or make things awkward. And for the first time in years it didn't feel like I had to brace for emotional impact. She left early, saying she didn't want to overstay, but thanked me for letting her come. And I said thank you for coming, and meant it. Sometime later, Jasmine shared that she had started going to therapy, that it was hard but helping, and she didn't bring it up like a badge, just mentioned it in passing, like someone finally opening a window in a room that had been shut for too long. I told her I was proud of her, and that I hoped she kept doing it for herself, not to get back what she lost. And she smiled and said that's the plan. By the time summer fully bloomed, Leo and I were planning our little trip to the coast, just the two of us. I wanted him to see the ocean for the first time, not through a screen or a story, but with his own eyes we saved together using a jar we called the Adventure Fund, and he would add coins from the couch cushions or the dollar his teacher gave him for helping carry supplies. I matched whatever he added, and together we made it happen. We took the train, which felt like magic to him, and stayed in a tiny cottage with blue shutters and wildflowers around the porch. He collected seashells, we ate fish and chips from a paper basket, and at night he curled beside me and said, "This is better than presents," and I kissed his forehead and whispered me because it was in those simple moments I found the life I had always deserved, not loud, not showy, but full of truth. On our last morning there I received an email from my mother, short and formal. She said she wanted to apologize, but didn't know how, and asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee. Sometime alone, I stared at the message for a long time, unsure what to feel. Part of me bristled, remembering the party, the words, the dismissal, the way she hadn't defended Leo even once. But another part of me felt something shift, a recognition maybe that she was at least trying. And so I replied, saying I would meet her once, not to rehash everything, but to speak openly, one adult to another. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes. She was early, something that surprised me, and she stood when I walked in, which she had never done before. I sat across from her, my guard up, but my heart steady, and she said, "I'm sorry," not in a rushed or dramatic way, but slowly, like each syllable carried weight. She admitted she had been wrong about many things, about Leo, about me, about what mattered. She said I was always trying to impress other people, and somewhere along the way I stopped seeing my own children as people to protect and started treating them like reflections to polish. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard her say, and I didn't rush to forgive. I didn't pretend it fixed everything. I just listened. And when she finished, I said, "I appreciate your words, but it will take time," and she nodded and said, "I know," and that was it. No begging, no guilt, just a start. She asked if she could send Leo a letter, and I said yes, but only if he wanted to read it, and that it had to be honest and kind, and she agreed, and we parted with a hug that felt both foreign and familiar. Leo did read the letter, and he asked me if he had to write back, and I said no, you never have to do anything that doesn't feel right. And he said maybe later, and that was enough. I wasn't trying to rebuild what once was. I was trying to build what could be something healthier, something earned, not forced. My father reached out too, not long after, through a voice message which shocked me. He sounded older, softer, and he said, "I watched the video of Leo's school play that Jasmine sent, and I cried because he's brilliant and I miss so much. And I'm sorry, I don't expect anything. I just want you to know I see it now, and I believe you always deserved better." And I didn't call back, I didn't reply, but I saved the message, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder that even the most stubborn hearts can learn, if they choose to. Leo continued to thrive. He made new friends at summer camp, tried new foods, and even learned how to ride a bike without training wheels. And every time he looked back to see if I was watching, I made sure I was present, cheering, steady, not distracted, not doubting. I was becoming the parent I had once wished I had, not perfect but present, and that was enough for him. One evening, as we were drawing together, he said, "Mom, do you think people can really change?" And I asked him what he thought, and he said, "I think they can, if they stop lying to themselves." And I nodded, because there was wisdom in that far beyond his years, and I told him, yes, baby people can change, but it takes truth and time. And he said, "I hope Grandma and Grandpa are telling the truth now." And I said, "Me too," and left it there, because that hope belonged to him, not me. We spent the rest of the summer building memories that felt like freedom: backyard tents, homemade lemonade, painting rocks, and naming them like pets. And through it all I kept noticing how light our world felt, not because we didn't have pain, but because we weren't pretending anymore. The next school year started, and Leo walked into his new classroom with confidence, his backpack slightly too big, and his eyes wide with wonder. And I stood at the door for a moment, taking in how far we had come, and when he turned to wave, I felt a surge of pride that nearly knocked me over, not just in him, but in myself, for surviving the storm and planting flowers in its wake. As autumn approached, I knew there might be more messages, more requests, more attempts from my parents to return, but I also knew I would meet them at the door of my boundaries, not out of spite but self-respect. And if they truly wanted to be part of Leo's world, they would have to show up without expectations and without erasing the past. and if they couldn't, then we would still be okay because we had built something whole without them. Winter returned once again, but this time our home felt different, not just because of the decorations or the soft glow of the string lights we had carefully placed along the walls, but because there was a sense of quiet peace between Leo and me that had not existed the year before. As the season settled in, the invitations to gatherings started rolling in like they always did, except this time there was one from Jasmine addressed to both Leo and me. She had decided to host a winter brunch, not just a Christmas party, and had made it explicitly clear in the message that all children were welcome and encouraged to attend. I reread the words twice, letting them sink in, and I realized she was trying in her own way to extend an olive branch not just to me, but to Leo directly. I looked over at him where he was seated on the floor with his building blocks deep in thought, and I asked, "Would you want to go to Aunt Jasmine's brunch this year?" And he looked up, his face unreadable for a second before he said, "Will there be hot chocolate?" And I laughed and said, "I'll make sure there is." And he nodded, then okay, but only if we leave when it stops feeling fun, and I promised we would. The morning of brunch came with soft snowfall outside, and the sky that pale kind of silver that makes everything seem gentle. Leo wore the sweater he had picked out himself, navy blue with a snowman, and he asked if he could bring the book he had been reading so he would have something to do if the grown-ups started talking too much, and I said of course. I dressed simple but warm, and we made a small batch of gingerbread cookies together to take with us. Leo insisted on packing them in his old lunchbox because it kept things from breaking. When we arrived at Jasmine's house, I was already preparing myself to stay alert to scan the room for any signs of discomfort for Leo or for me, but something in the air felt different. Jasmine opened the door and greeted us with a smile and a cheerful, "Leo, you're just in time. I need help putting the marshmallows in the cocoa." And she crouched to his height to say it, not talking over him but to him, and I watched him smile shyly before following her into the kitchen. I stepped inside, slowly taking in the scene. There were a few guests already, mostly neighbors, some of Jasmine's friends, a couple of relatives I barely remembered, and to my surprise my parents were there, too, sitting near the fireplace with plates in their hands. They looked up as I entered, and for a moment it was like time paused, not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet kind of awareness where everyone notices something at the same time. My mother gave a small wave, nothing too eager, but not cold either, and my father gave a nod and then looked back at his plate, and I chose not to make it more than what it was. Leo returned quickly holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa, one for each of us, and I thanked him, and he said, "There's whipped cream too, if you want." I helped Jasmine put it on, and I followed him to the kitchen where Jasmine was wiping her hands on a towel. She looked up and said, "I'm glad you came," and I said, "Thanks for inviting us," and she just nodded like we had moved past needing to explain everything. The party was simple but full of warmth, children running in and out of rooms, laughter coming from the hallway, someone was playing soft carols in the background, and the food smelled like comfort, like cinnamon and cloves and baked apples. Leo stayed close at first, but then slowly began to explore, watching the other kids joining a group that was building a tower out of plastic cups. Cheering when it crashed down, I stayed by the window sipping cocoa and taking in the way things can change when people stop pretending and start showing up fully, not as who they think they should be, but as who they truly are. At one point, my father approached me holding a small plate of food. He didn't say anything right away, just stood beside me as I watched Leo, and finally he said, "He's growing up fast," and I nodded, "He is." And then he said, "I know I missed a lot, and I don't expect you to just forget everything." And I replied, "I haven't forgotten, but I'm open to seeing what happens next." And he gave a slow nod like someone receiving a sentence they knew was fair. Then he walked back to his seat and didn't try to press more. Jasmine gave Leo a small wrapped gift before we left, something she said she saw at the bookstore and thought he would like, and he opened it in the car on the way home. Graphic novel about a young explorer with a talking map, and he grinned and said, "This looks cool," and I knew then that even small gestures, when sincere, can plant something that might grow later at home. Leo wanted to put the gift under the tree and save it for Christmas morning, which surprised me, and when I asked why, he said, "I like looking forward to things," and I thought about how different that sentiment was from the little boy who had once asked if Christmas was only for adults, and I realized how far we had come, not just in miles, but in meaning the next day, Leo asked if we could invite some of his school friends over for a snowman building afternoon, and I said yes, and we spent the morning rolling snow and decorating the yard with crooked scarves and old buttons and mismatched hats and laughter that rose into the cold air like steam. I made hot chocolate in a big pot and served it in paper cups with cinnamon sticks, and when one of the parents asked if I did events often, I said no, this is new, and it feels good. The rest of the month moved gently. Jasmine stopped by once to return a dish I had left, and we talked for a while about books, and how weirdly warm the weather had been, and she didn't bring up the past, and I didn't expect her to. We were learning how to exist in the present without constantly tripping over old debris. Leo asked if we could bake cookies for his class holiday party, and we did sugar cookies with too much frosting and rainbow sprinkles, and he told me that one of his classmates said his mom makes the best cookies, and he replied mine too, and it made my chest ache in the best way, because there was a time I had doubted myself so deeply that I thought he might agree if someone said otherwise, and now he didn't flinch. Christmas morning came with quiet joy. Not extravagance, just meaningful moments. Leo woke up early and tiptoed into my room whispering it's time, and we opened gifts by the small tree in the living room, wrapped in newspaper comics, and tied with red yarn because that's how he liked it. We laughed, we hugged, we played board games in pajama, and later went for a walk in the snow where he pointed out shapes in the clouds, and I listened like it was the most important lecture I had ever attended. We returned home to find a card had been slipped through our mail slot. It was from my parents' simple handwritten inside, saying, "We're thinking of you and Leo and hoping you're having a joyful morning." And while it wasn't everything, it was something that once would have felt impossible and now felt cautiously welcome. Leo asked if he could draw a thank you card, and I said of course, and he drew a picture of our tree and our cookies and wrote, "Thank you for the card. I hope your Christmas is cozy. Love, Leo." And we mailed it that evening, walking to the box together under a sky full of stars. Later, as I tucked him in, he asked, "Do you think next year will be like this too?" And I said, "I hope it's even better." And he said, "Me too," and fell asleep with a smile on his face, and I sat beside him for a while watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, and I whispered to the quiet room, "Thank you for this peace, for this home, for this child, for this moment." And in that silence I realized this was the kind of Christmas I had always wanted, not one filled with noise and expectation, but with clarity and connection and love that needed no performance to be real. The days that followed Christmas were slow and gentle, and I found myself appreciating the quiet more than ever before. There was no pressure to perform, no expectations to meet, and for the first time in years I wasn't carrying around the weight of unresolved tension. Leo seemed lighter too. He started humming more while playing, and he even suggested writing a list of things we could do next holiday season, just in case we wanted to make it a tradition. He titled it Adventures for Next December and wrote it in big uneven letters at the top of a notebook page. I smiled as I watched him carefully write things like go ice skating at night, or make our own ornaments, or host a cookie contest, and I thought about how children, when given space, can dream so freely. The new year came quietly. We didn't go to any parties, just stayed home, played card games, watched the fireworks from our window, and toasted with apple juice in mismatched mugs. Leo declared it the best new year ever, and I didn't disagree. School resumed shortly after, and life returned to its usual rhythm, except now that rhythm had a softness to it, a gentleness that hadn't existed before Jasmine and I had settled into a steady connection. We weren't suddenly best friends, but we were no longer walking on eggshells either. She texted once a week, sometimes just a meme or a link to a parenting article, or a question about a book for Leo, and I responded when I felt like it, without pressure, without guilt. One afternoon in February she called unexpectedly, her voice nervous, as she asked if I could meet her for coffee. I said yes, and we agreed to meet at a small place near the park. Leo was at a friend's house for a sleepover, and I had time. When I arrived, she was already seated, a cappuccino in front of her, and she looked up with a hesitant smile when I sat down. She got straight to the point. She told me she had been going to therapy, and that her therapist had encouraged her to apologize in person, not because she was trying to earn forgiveness, but because it was part of her own healing. She said, "I hurt you and I hurt Leo and I've been trying to figure out why I needed to be right so badly that I forgot how to be kind. I didn't respond right away. I just let her talk. She went on to say that for a long time she had been carrying this idea that she had to be the successful one, the organized one, the favorite daughter, and how that belief had twisted her into someone she barely recognized, especially during the holidays. She said, watching me walk into that Christmas party with Leo and seeing how you carried yourself with grace and strength after everything, it made me realize how much I had missed by holding on. Resentment. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I was glad she was doing the work to understand herself. I didn't offer immediate absolution, but I also didn't shut her down. I said what matters to me is that Leo feels safe and seen, and if you're willing to be a real part of his life, that starts with consistency. And she nodded with tears in her eyes and said, I want to try. We sat there in silence for a while, just sipping our drinks and letting the air between us shift slowly into something new, not old, not yet new, but possible. In March, Leo got an award at school for kindness, and his teacher emailed me to say he had been going out of his way to include a new student who had just moved from another city. I read the message twice, and my heart swelled with pride when I told him. He shrugged and said, I just know what it feels like to be left out, and I don't want anyone else to feel that way. Later that evening, I cried in the shower, not out of sadness, but out of the overwhelming feeling of gratitude that my son had learned empathy, not from being taught, but from experiencing pain and choosing not to pass it on. A few weeks later, my parents invited us to dinner. It was the first time in years they had extended a direct invitation to Leo and me without any qualifiers. I was hesitant but curious, so I agreed. When we arrived, they had set the table for 3 with Leo's favorite green plate and his name on a little folded card. He laughed when he saw it and said, this is fancy. And my mother smiled and said, for our special guest we had a simple dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables, nothing extravagant but made with care. During the meal, they asked Leo about his favorite books and what games he liked to play, and for once they didn't interrupt or talk over him. They just listened, and I watched as he began to lean in, answering more openly, smiling more. By the time dessert came around, my father stood and brought out a small wrapped box and handed it to Leo, saying, this is something I found in the attic and thought you might like to have. Leo opened it carefully, and inside was a vintage compass, slightly rusted but still gleaming, and my father said it belonged to your great-grandfather. He used it when he worked on ships. I thought maybe you could use it on your own adventures. Leo's eyes lit up, and he held it like treasure, asking 100 questions about how it worked and where it had been, and my father answered every one that night. When we got home, Leo placed the compass on his bookshelf and said, I think he's trying to be better, and I said I think so too. In April, Jasmine invited us to her birthday brunch, and Leo helped me bake a cake, bring chocolate with raspberry filling, her favorite. He wrote happy birthday Jasmine in bright red icing and added a smiley face in the corner. She laughed when she saw it and said, this is the best cake I've ever received, and Leo beamed with pride. After the party, Jasmine pulled me aside and handed me an envelope. Inside was a photo of us from the Christmas brunch, Leo, Jasmine, and me, all smiling, and she said I had this printed because I wanted to remember that day, not because it was perfect, but because it was the day we started again. I thanked her and later framed it, placing it on the hallway wall where light hit it in the morning. By May, things had settled into something resembling harmony, not forced, not perfect, but real. Leo had made more friends, was doing well in school, and had started asking about joining a local art club. I signed him up, and he began attending every Saturday, coming home with paint on his sleeves and stories about what he had made. One evening, as we were cleaning up dinner, he asked if Jasmine had always liked art, and I said I think she liked being good at things, and sometimes that meant she forgot to just enjoy them. And he said, I hope she's learning to enjoy stuff again, and I smiled and said I think she is. At the end of the month, Jasmine texted to ask if Leo wanted to join her for a weekend pottery class for kids, and I checked with him, and he said sure, that sounds messy and fun. They went, and he came back with a lopsided bowl painted orange and green, and he Said it's for you to put your earrings in, and I laughed and said it's perfect in June. Jasmine hosted a backyard picnic and invited both families plus neighbors and friends. It was warm, the kind of day that smells like sunscreen and lemonade, and Leo ran around barefoot playing tag and eating watermelon with juice dripping down his chin. My parents came too, bringing folding chairs and homemade lemonade. And when I looked around the yard at the different pockets of conversations, the laughter, the way people moved freely between groups, I realized this was what I had always wanted. Not perfect family, not a flawless holiday, but moments like this where everyone chose to show up as they were without masks or performance. Leo came running to me holding a water balloon and asked if I was ready for battle, and I said always, and we spent the next hour in a splash war that ended with us soaked and breathless and laughing. My mother brought out towels and said, "You two are wild," and I said that's the goal. Later, as the sun began to set, Jasmine brought out sparklers and handed one to each child and one to me. She said, "For making it this far," and I lit mine and held it up as the tiny sparks danced, and Leo stood beside me waving his through the air, writing his name in fire. And I thought about how far we had come from that cold, dismissive moment when he was once left out to this warm, inclusive one where he belonged, where he was celebrated. And I whispered thank you to the sky, not to anyone in particular, but to everything that had allowed this transformation to unfold. By July, everything felt like it had shifted into a version of life I once believed was impossible, not perfect, not a fairy tale, but real, full of effort and softness and daily choices that felt intentional. Leo had a summer break filled with camps, art sessions, hikes with his friends, and sleepovers that always ended with him telling me funny stories while brushing his teeth. Late at night one morning, while packing his lunch, he looked up and asked, "Do you think everyone deserves a second chance?" And I paused, thinking about how far we had come and how hard that question really was. I said, "I think people deserve the chance to show they can change, and it's up to us if we want to give them that space." He nodded like he understood, then said, "I'm glad you gave everyone that chance, because now I get to have 2 Christmases and extra cake." And I laughed because leave it to Leo to see the joy. Double desserts. In late August, my mother called and asked if I would consider letting Leo spend the weekend with her and my father alone. For the first time, she said, "We'd like to make it special just for him, take him to the planetarium, and maybe do a craft day if he's up for it." I hesitated, not because I didn't trust them, but because that request would have sounded absurd a year ago. I asked Leo, and he screamed yes before I even finished the sentence. So I packed his overnight bag, included a list of his bedtime routines and snacks he liked, and dropped him off at their house with a hug and a quiet prayer that they'd live up to this new version of themselves. On Sunday night, when I picked him up, he came running out wearing a homemade astronaut helmet and carrying a photo album they had started together titled Leo's Missions. And he said, "Grandma says we'll add to it every time I visit." I hugged him tightly and looked at my mother, who simply said, "Thank you for trusting us." And I saw in her eyes a mix of pride, humility, and perhaps a little wonder at how far we had all come. School started again in September, and Jasmine offered to take Leo to pick out school supplies. They returned with a cart full of things he needed, and plenty he didn't, including a light-up pen shaped like a dragon, which he insisted helped him write faster. I thanked her for spoiling him a little, and she shrugged, saying, "I'm just making up for lost time." Later that week, she surprised us by attending Leo's first parent-teacher meeting with me, not because she had to, but because she said, "I want to understand the parts of his life I used to ignore." The teacher complimented Leo's empathy, his focus, and how he always made room for others in group activities, and I felt this quiet pride knowing that despite everything, my son had grown into someone strong and kind and rooted in love. In October, Leo asked if we could host a Halloween party for the neighborhood kids. I hesitated, thinking about the work involved, but he looked so excited. I said yes, and together we spent weeks planning it. Jasmine offered help and even came over to carve pumpkins with Leo, who declared hers the scariest and messiest. We hung up decorations, made spider cupcakes, and turned the backyard into a tiny haunted maze. On the night of the party, children filled the space with laughter and shrieks, and parents stood around sipping cider and chatting casually. My parents came too, dressed as a wizard and a garden gnome, and they brought home made caramel apples. Leo called it the best night ever and fell asleep on the couch with frosting on his nose as I carried him to bed later. Jasmine handed me a framed photo from the evening, it candid of Leo mid-laugh, his dragon pen sticking out of his pocket, and she said, "This feels like our second act, doesn't it?" I nodded because she was right. The life we were building felt like a new chapter, one not written out of obligation, but out of choice and healing. In November, Jasmine invited us to a gratitude dinner, something she was trying with her friends. Everyone brings a dish and shares one thing they're grateful for. Leo said he wanted to bring mashed potatoes shaped like stars, and he spent the whole afternoon crafting them with serious focus. That night, as we all sat around a long table filled with warmth and soft candlelight, Leo stood up shyly and said, "I'm thankful for second chances and for my family, even if they were a little grumpy last year." Everyone laughed, and Jasmine reached over to ruffle his hair, saying, "We deserved that roast in December." Leo started making a countdown calendar, not just for Christmas, but for what he called happy things. Every square had something different: paint day, cookie day, movie night, game night, just us doing something fun, and it reminded me how children find celebration in the smallest details. We followed the calendar, and every day brought a new smile. One evening, Jasmine asked if she could take Leo shopping for gifts. He excitedly agreed and returned home later with a wrapped box he hid in his closet, saying, "Top secret." On Christmas Eve, my parents invited us over for dinner, and this time the house was fully decorated with a chair for Leo, set between his grandparents, and a hand-drawn name tag that read Captain Leo. My father had even set up a tiny telescope in the backyard for Leo to explore the stars after dinner. We shared stories and memories, and Jasmine surprised everyone by bringing out a slideshow of our year highlights: Leo's birthday, the Halloween party, the picnic, the art club, moments stitched together like a patchwork of healing. We all sat watching in silence until the last slide read, "We made it through together," and everyone clapped. Even my father, who rarely showed emotion, got up and raised a toast, saying, "To family, to forgiveness, and to Leo for being the glue we didn't know we needed." That night as we left, Leo handed each of them handmade cards and said, "Thank you for seeing me this year." On Christmas morning, Leo woke up before dawn, dragging me to the living room, where he handed me the top secret box. Inside was a small charm with a star on one side and the word "shine" on the other. He said, "I picked it because you always shine for me, even when it's dark." And I hugged him tight, tears filling my eyes, knowing this was the kind of love that anchored every change we had fought for. Jasmine arrived a bit later with breakfast casserole and a handmade ornament that said "Year of Light," and we spent the morning unwrapping gifts, telling stories, and sipping cocoa. Leo looked around and said, "This is my favorite version of Christmas," and I agreed, because it wasn't about perfection or appearances, it was about presence, about showing up even when it was hard, and choosing love again and again. As the year closed and we stood at the edge of a new one, I thought about all the things we had lost: the illusions, the roles, the false harmony, but I also thought about what we had gained: honesty, effort, growth, and the kind of love that doesn't erase pain but transforms it into something beautiful. Leo wrote his New Year wish on a paper star and hung it by the window. It said, "More laughter, more cookies, and more hugs," and I knew without a doubt we were going to be okay. Outro: this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.